All right, so I'll talk a little bit about countering misconceptions, and I'll put a pretty big emphasis on refutation text because a lot of my work recently is focused on refutation texts. Um, but before I do, let's see here. Does that work? There we go. I just want to start by saying that I'm absolutely fascinated by learning, and that most of my work looks at how humans learn, whether that's from graphics with absolutely no text at all. I always loved IKEA furniture. And if you look at the new Lego instructional models, what's really fascinating is they can teach a lot of information. There's a lot of information presented there, but they don't leverage any words. And so they can convey lots of information without any words. And that's part of what I'm really interested in is multimedia design and how do we learn from graphics, but also how children learn about STEM concepts, how we learn together, how we learn online, and then also some of these bigger concepts. So, how we form these mental models, how do we bring multiple pieces of ideas together to form that mental model? How might we update that mental model, pull those pieces apart, rearrange some of them, and put them back together to be more scientifically correct? So, we'll start off light. You might have heard. You might have heard that toilets flush backwards in the southern hemisphere. I don't know if anybody else believed this. I did for the longest time. I've never been to the southern hemisphere, so I can never empirically verify this. But for me, this all started with an episode of The Simpsons. I think it was like season three, where the Simpsons go to Australia, and of course, the U.S. consulate has installed a USA branded machine to make sure that the toilets flush the correct way, right? And everybody salutes the toilet. Um, and so you might think that's actually not correct, right? There is a thing called the Coriolis effect, where things do spin in a different direction in the southern hemisphere, but it's on much larger scales, so not toilets. Plus, the way the toilets work when you flush, they inject water and the whole thing spins around. So you might have thought the toilets flush backwards, but they don't. You might have also thought that the blood in your veins is blue because it's deoxygenated. Um, that's also not true, right? I don't know if it's due to bad medical diagrams showing some that are red and some that are blue. That's really easy misconception to pick up. From our own experiences, when you stop breathing, right, your lips turn blue, your fingers can turn blue. So it makes sense in that way. Um, and I'll never forget we had this after school program where we were teaching this, and a young boy looks at his mom and says, "Mom, like I thought that the blood was blue because I could see that it's blue. Like you've been lying to me my entire life." And the mother was quite taken aback, like, "Well, I thought it was blue too." Um, and said, "No, no, your blood is red. It's always red." So you might have thought this, but that in fact is not correct. And you might have thought that going out in the cold with wet hair will make you catch a cold. My mother would tell me this all the time, right? Make sure you put your hat on, make sure you dry your hair, make sure you bundle up, because if you go outside, you're gonna catch cold. You're gonna catch a death of cold. Um, in the Bay Area, that's definitely not going to happen. But also, just generally speaking, right? That's not how viruses are transmitted. You have to be in contact with other viruses, right? It's not just that a drop in temperature is going to make you catch the cold. So these are pretty innocuous. Many people have them, and they're not a super huge deal, right? But some of these misconceptions can be quite a big deal. Um, Climate change is a hoax, right? What if climate change is a big hoax and we create a better world for absolutely no reason? How terrible would that be? Um, that's not correct, right? Climate change is real. It's caused by humans. 98% of the scientists agree on this fact. But there's a growing group of individuals that are trying to say that climate change is not quite real. And that can have some major implications down the line. You might have heard the vaccines cause autism. We thought that we had finally squashed this until more recently, and now this is making the headlines again, right? There is no evidence to support the claim that vaccines cause autism. However, it's incredibly difficult to empirically prove a negative. You can't prove that not, right? That's not how logical proofs work. There just is no evidence that vaccines cause autism. However, right? There's a lot of anecdotes around this. These vaccines and onset of autism tend to correlate in time and space. Um, but again, there's no evidence to support that. You might have heard that learning styles are a thing. If I'm on your committee, I'm going to be really grumpy because learning styles are not a thing, right? You might have heard that there's kinesthetic learners, there's auditory learners, there's visual learners. There really isn't any evidence to support this, right? We all might have our own preferences, but we have a pretty sizable area in our brain dedicated to processing visual stimuli, processing and producing speech. We're all visual learners. We're all auditory learners. We're all kinesthetic learners. We might have preferences, but these don't define who we are. And we should all be able to learn visually, kinesthetically, and auditorially, right? So these are some misconceptions. Some of them can be rather big, and some of them can be rather small. And I'll sort of use the running definition today that misconceptions can be defined like conceptions that are not necessarily correct, right? It can be rather small, like this is how you catch a cold, or it could belie a much larger conception. So the idea that fin placement on sharks and dolphins are different, that might be a small discrete fact that you might have a misconception about. But that underlies a very significant difference between sharks and dolphins, right? They're one are mammals, one are not. And so these might be very, very deeply rooted, and they might be very connected to your own personal identity, such that changing them might cause quite a bit of an emotion, right? Or maybe not. So why do I even care about misconceptions? Because I love learning, but I really like misconceptions. I really like when learning gets difficult, when learning gets emotionally laden, and all those sticky problems that people tend to have. And I really like misconceptions because they're really difficult. They make learning more difficult. And this is pretty fascinating to me. Generally speaking, the best predictor of future knowledge is prior knowledge. So, all things being equal, if you have two students of equal ability, one has more math knowledge than the other one, and they both enter the same math class, the one with more prior knowledge will, on average, learn more than the student who has less, simply because they have more of a well to draw from, right? So, generally speaking, prior knowledge is the best predictor for future knowledge, except when that prior knowledge is incorrect. Um, you probably all experienced this too. If you've ever switched from, I have an Android phone, my wife has an iPhone, and I can work my phone pretty well. She can work her phone pretty well. But when I have to try to work on something on her phone, I have to relearn how iOS is configured now. It's been a long time since I've had an iPhone, so the operating system's quite different. It's really painful and really frustrating. Switching from PC to Mac or switching statistical softwares or word processing softwares, it'd be a lot easier if you had no knowledge and we're learning it from scratch than if you had knowledge that doesn't align with what you're trying to do. And then there's some of these deeper problems, right? They have repercussions beyond the individual. This is Senator James Inhofe, sitting U.S. Senator back in the day in Oklahoma, explaining to Congress, and I'm sure to many members of his family and anyone that would listen, that climate change is not real. And for evidence of this, he's bringing a snowball to the Senate floor. It was the toss heard around the world, right? He tossed a colleague a snowball and went, well, see, therefore, I have a snowball. It cannot be warm. Therefore, global warming doesn't exist. And that's really problematic because that's moving beyond the individual, right? If you think something that might be problematic for you, but now these repercussions are extending beyond. If I feel that vaccines cause autism or that there's really scary adverse effects to vaccines, I'm already vaccinated. It's too late. My parents did it when I didn't remember, but maybe I delay the onset of vaccines for my children, or I spread this misinformation online to others. And these can have really far-reaching consequences, right? Senators tell other senators, senators vote. There's lots of money involved here. We can take action or we can refuse to take action as a country. We can vote folks into power that will push for certain things, or we can vote for folks that won't. We can defund certain programs that might help. So on some of these scales, right, failure to vaccinate children in California has had multiple measles outbreaks over the last 20, 30 years, right? Small pockets, but measles is a highly infectious disease that spreads really quickly. And, 40 years ago, it was nearly eradicated, but now these pockets keep springing up. And that might have nothing to do with you because maybe you're immunocompromised. And so having no fault of your own, now you're exposed to these types of things. So that's why I really get interested around these misconceptions because they can have really deep consequences. Okay, but enough doom and gloom. How do we overcome these things? Um, Refutation texts seem to work fairly well, and I say almost surprisingly well because they're a very simple modification of traditional text. Um, so this is one from Tippett, and it's basically you state the misconception, then you refute it, and then you give the person the scientifically correct information, right? Some people believe that camels store water in its hump. They think that the hump gets smaller as the camel uses up water, but that's not true. In fact, the hump stores fat and grows smaller if the camel hasn't eaten for a long time. Really simple addition, but it's been wildly effective. And we'll talk about our meta-analysis that shows how effective they can be. For a long time, there's been a lot of pushback on refutational approaches because the idea was that if students didn't hold a misconception, then we as educators don't want to introduce a misconception, right? We don't want to be putting out false information. But I think the research has shown that those concerns, that we can put them to rest. So, excuse me. So, how do they work? Well, there's a number of theoretical models, and I leverage this one quite often. This is Gail Sinatra's or Dolan Sinatra's cognitive restructuring of knowledge model. It's been around since the 90s. And I should say it's a conceptual change model. There's lots of conceptual change models. Folks in the conceptual change get very grumpy about their models. This is the one that I'm leveraging just as an example. And I recognize that there's lots of other ones that people really like. But I fell into this one for a couple of reasons. First, well, Gail Sinatra was my mentor at USC, and the way that your mentor thinks tends to bleed into the way that you think. And so this model made a lot of sense to me, right? Essentially, this looks at both the learner and the message. So all the information that a learner brings to an interaction, all their prior knowledge, how coherent they are, how committed they are to that idea, their motivation to process things. Are they dissatisfied? Are they frustrated? Is there a social context around? Do they have a lot of friends that agree or disagree with this thing? So they bring all of this individual stuff to the table, and then they engage with a message. And that message needs to be comprehensible, coherent, plausible, and rhetorically compelling. Part of why this model spoke so well to me was because previously to USC, I used to do a lot of work with text graphics and multimedia learning. And from a multimedia learning perspective, we're often changing the characteristics of the message to make learning more efficient. So, can I add graphics to make this information more comprehensible? Can I make it more coherent? Can I reduce cognitive load? Can I change the text and graphic pairings around to open up different modalities to allow learners to process more faster? So multimedia learning fit really well into this CRKM. There's other groups out there. We'll talk about those in a minute. Um, so some past work, 2016, 2017, 2019, and I apologize, there's a lot of arrows. It's going to get really messy. But a lot of my work focused on leveraging refutation texts and leveraging the CRKM as a theoretical model. Um, So Lombardi, Danielson, and Young, we were looking at climate change and can we shift learners' plausibility judgments. Climate change is really big, it's really amorphous, it's really scary, it's really hard to understand. Can we get learners to even think that, well, maybe it's plausible? I don't have to accept that climate change is true, but can I accept that it's plausible that it could be happening? Can I kind of open that door and allow them to engage with this work? This was looking at pre-service teachers leveraging refutation texts, and yeah, it worked. We were able to move the needle on both knowledge and plausibility. Danielson, Sinatra, Kendu, and Lucia Mason et al. We were looking at, can we add graphics? Can we modify refutation texts? Um, Danielson et al. Looked at climate change texts. We added graphics, we added analogies, and yeah, it worked. We were able to increase knowledge around climate change, increase understanding around climate change. Um, the analogy worked really well. The refutation text worked really well. Graphic, not so much. That was kind of a bummer. Lucia et al. Or the Mason et al. Study, again, we added graphics to refutation text. This one was around seasonal change, looking at Italian college students. And again, the refutation text worked, but the graphic, not so much. It was really hard to add on to a refutation text. It seemed like the refutation text just worked really well. But anything above that was harder to move the needle to get sort of that exponential or that extra push. Hetty et al., Thacker et al. Here we're looking at, can we make the text more rhetorically compelling? Can we tweak issues of the refutation text? Can we make it more persuasive, right? Hetty et al. Looked at genetically modified foods. So did Thacker et al. Looking at university students. Hetty et al. was university students at USC. Thacker was international students at USC in Germany and Canada. And again, yeah, the refutation texts worked. We were able to move the needle. But it was around this time that we were kind of getting a little frustrated. All of these studies were experimental designs, and all of them had to have a control group, which had an expository text. And if you're running experimental design, it's really frustrating to have half of your participants basically in the control condition, where they don't really do very much. And really, it was starting to serve, in our minds, almost as a manipulation check. Can we show that the refutation works? Yes, it does. Now we want to move on to some more interesting questions. So we started having some conversations at conferences, at dinners, at socials. Pawnee and I, from the Danielson, Sinatra, and Kendu, her and I started going back and forth about other theoretical models. And she had come out with the knowledge revision component framework. And essentially, Pawnee was a reading researcher. She looked at how we update our mental models when reading texts, multiple texts. And we started wondering, well, is the power of a refutation text, maybe it doesn't need to be so complicated with this CRKM and all of these moving parts. Maybe it's a working memory phenomenon. Maybe just having two pieces of information in time and space forces the learner to hold them in mind at the same time and realize that both of them can't be true, right? It might be the case that as you're reading complicated climate change text, that you're maxing out your cognitive capabilities, so you're not thinking back to all the incongruent arguments that have been made. You're kind of uh, fully focused on the text. What if it's working memory? What if we bring that refutation in mind? Then you have to notice it because you have to read it, and then you can overcome those misconceptions. Okay, that's plausible. And there's been some other folks that have been doing some work with medical models for a long time, leveraging the analogy of vaccinations or medical treatment, right? So we can pre-bunk or debunk. We can tell you the misconception up front because we know that students are going to go onto the internet and people on the internet tell lies. Who knows what you're going to find out there? So we're going to let you know ahead of time. Hey, you might find a bunch of baloney. That's not true. In fact, it's this thing. And that might make students less likely to be sort of infected with those misconceptions in the same way that if we vaccinate you with a weaker version of the virus, you'll be able to slough it off if you encounter it in the wild. Okay, we're running out of time. I'm going to speed up. So it was about this time that I went back and realized, wow, all these studies could actually be explained not from a correct theory, but through these other theories as well. And that's a little problematic. So I'll talk about the meta-analysis and how we started to write this grant. And essentially we thought, well, I really want to do a meta-analysis. And Dr. Adeshope and I were thinking, well, we've got a lot of expertise here at WSU. I do a lot of conceptual change work. He does a lot of meta-analysis work. We should do this thing. But at conferences, we talked to Gail Sinatra. She also does a lot of conceptual change work. Erica Patel had just moved to USC. She does a lot of meta-analysis work. They had the exact same idea. Oh no. Unlike lots of experimental designs where we can kind of layer them all on top of each other, we can't really do that with a meta-analysis. Nobody wants to read two meta-analyses about the same exact thing. No journals are going to publish that. So we thought, okay, what are we going to do? We're not going to kind of fight to see who gets to do it. Why don't we combine our resources and we'll create one of the largest meta-analyses to date. And we'll put all of our hypotheses, we'll pre-register all of them. We'll pull from three different theoretical frameworks, although we'll be theoretically agnostic because reviewers were very grumpy about certain theories. And we're saying, look, we're not testing theories. We're just looking at all the things that could be predicted from all these different theories. And we just want to see what pans out. And we ended up having 12 individuals on this project, which is the largest paper I've ever written with 12 co-authors. It was absolutely a blast, although some of those project meetings definitely get contentious, especially when you're thinking about what conceptions are and how to measure learning. But we did it. We submitted this $500,000 NSF proposal. We won. We had a fair bit of back and forth, and we had 3 years to create this absolutely amazing meta-analysis. So let me talk about that. Our overarching question was, to what extent do refutation texts facilitate change in knowledge and also emotion? We knew from our own experiences that emotions are really powerful in learning, and we wanted to know, do ref texts facilitate that? And also, what characteristics of the texts, what designs of the studies, what can moderate this effect? Okay, so I'm going to put up a wall of text. You don't need to read it. It's in the paper. But we had 23 moderators. Everything under the sun, anything we could think of. Does the text topic matter? Does it matter if it's chemistry or psychology or math or engineering? Does it matter if it's controversial, like climate change or GMOs, or non-controversial, like mathematics or microbiology? Does it matter about the characteristics of the text? How long it is? How long is the refutation? How long is the text compared to the control? What about how narrative it is? How much cohesion it is? The absolute length of the text? Was there random assignment? Were people randomly assigned to experimental conditions? Was it done in a lab? Was it done online? Was it done online but with a person watching? What country are they coming from? There's a lot of work from America, some from Canada and Eastern Europe, or I'm sorry, Western Europe. But what other countries could we find? And what about trust in government, right? Americans aren't always the most trusting folks. And if the CDC says this is how vaccines work, but we don't trust the government, maybe just trust in government writ large would predict. So all of these different things. And also, how did they measure knowledge? Was it misconceptions? Was it true, false? Was it multiple choice? Was it open answer? Everything under the sun. We had 23 moderators, and we found over, I think 7,741 articles. In the end, 71 made it, which was more than double the last meta-analysis that had just come out. So we really extended the work. There had to be some exclusions. It had to be experimental. It had to be a between subject design, so no within subjects designs. There had to be a controlled text, so they had to see expository text. And it could not be interactive, which ended up throwing out a lot of studies. But we'll come back to that in a minute. And what did we find? It worked. Hooray. Hooray for us. We did it, right? It worked, which was really exciting. But we found no effect on positive emotions. We found no effect on negative emotions. And we found no effect on attitudes, which was really surprising. And actually, digging a little bit deeper, we didn't have enough power for some of those. So part of this was that despite the fact that everybody is talking about how emotionally laden learning is, especially around things like climate change, turns out nobody was actually doing the work to look at emotions and knowledge change. So that was a problem. And what about all those moderators? Well, it took a lot of analyses, and none of them came back. In fact, none of the moderators moderated the effect of refutation text. So we had to do a couple of laps around the block when that came back. We were kind of sitting there staring at each other like, well, what do we do now? How is that even possible? And it wasn't until I was, I kind of had to step away, read a book, go sit with my family for a while, and I thought, oh, it's like a Dr. Seuss effect. They work on a boat, they work with a goat, they work in the rain, they work on a train. Refutation texts seem to work across all subjects, across all groups, across all ages. They seem to work everywhere, and none of these moderators are really impacting whether or not they work, which is really kind of neat. So what started as a null finding actually turned out to be one of our more powerful findings that, overall, we found a consistent and statistically significant advantage of ref text over non-refutation text in confronting scientific misconceptions. So if you're looking for something to help students overcome misconceptions, ref text seemed to work, which is very, very cool. Okay, so I know I'm running out of time, but I'll talk just really briefly about some of the work that we're doing. How do we move these things forward? So I had a couple of other studies, and this meta-analysis really framed the way that I was thinking about ref text. And so a couple of studies real quick that we've been looking at. This one with Sinatra, Travers, Muse, Peckrin, and Hetty. So we've got folks at South Carolina, McGill, Munich, Oklahoma. How do learners engage with multiple texts, right? Not just a single refutation text or an expository text, but how do they learn in the wild? You go on X or Twitter, and people have all kinds of opinions. No one just goes online, reads one text, and goes, "Well, that's enough opinions for one day," and closes it, right? They probably read a bunch of conflicting texts. So, what happens, and how might their emotions change as a result? We're looking at university undergrads. We were looking at climate change. And what we found was that for students who saw two congruent texts, so texts that agreed with one another, they learned more than if the studies were in disagreement, right? So it simulated a refutation text, but it wasn't exactly a ref text. It was more along the lines of what you encounter in your daily life. So it was nice that we found that congruency worked, but we also found that there was a numbing effect for emotions. That not only did emotions not change, but actually emotions just across the board dipped. That students learning about climate change had a reduction in emotions, almost as if they were taking a step back. The more that they read about it, everything dropped. That was a little concerning. Danielson et al., we were looking at, again, can we extend this to misinformation? So we had multiple texts, and here we had explicit refutations and misinformation text. And what if we change the topic order, right? What if we saw a misconception first and then a refutation, or a refutation first and then a misinformation? Can we inoculate against some of this misinformation? We changed the topic to fluoride because it's a little bit less emotionally salient, although for some groups it's very emotionally salient. But for the general public, they don't care much about it. So can we move the needle on emotions? And how should we approach misinformation in a way that's really reflective of how our students enter the classroom? Sometimes they have no idea. Sometimes they come in with misconceptions. So what should we do? We found that actually, regardless of text top or text presentation, everybody learned. But again, the refutation group learned the most. So they overcame the most misconceptions. And the traditional approach, which was the wait and see approach, we wait for students to have these misconceptions. Then we give them the correct information with no refutations. That group did the worst. So that's sort of standard scientific practice that we often do. It worked, but it was the least effective. We also didn't really see an impact on emotions either, although getting out in front and being first in line especially with the refutation text, slightly lowered some of those negative emotions, but it wasn't as impactful as we thought. And you're thinking, well, what about graphics and misconceptions? So some recent work we've done with GON, I'll highlight some of our amazing students here. Uh, how do we add like graphics to ref text? Will that make it more interesting, or will it really distract? Here we looked at genetically modified foods. This is a nice genetically modified sausage banana. There's some really interesting graphics if you go online. Um, we're looking at undergraduate students in China to see, do the refutation and graphics facilitate more conceptual change, or do graphics actually pull attention away? What do these graphics do? We found that the refutation text, again, outperformed expository texts, and that the graphics actually distracted from learning. So they functioned as seductive details, which is kind of what we thought we did, what we thought they would, but there was no interaction between these seductive details and the ref text. It didn't hurt the ref text, it didn't help the ref text. Again, the ref text is sort of standing on its own. And then lastly, and possibly one of my favorite studies because of how experimentally clean it is. I really do love experimental designs. We ran a Solomon Foursquare group because I kept thinking, well, okay, we've looked at the vaccination approach. What about Pani's model of working memory, right? Pre-testing might prime working memory in the same way that a ref text might prime working memory. So what if the ref text effect can be explained by working memory? And what if it's just a pretest? Would that give you an advantage? So we ran a Solomon Foursquare design. Some folks got the refutation with a pretest. Some folks refutation no pretest. Some expository pretest. Some expository no pretest. And how does this impact their judgments of learning? And we found a very suspicious non-interaction, probably due to low power, but the ref text with the pretest performed pretty well. But since we had limited power, essentially we found a main effect for ref text. So ref text, again, outperformed their expository counterparts. Although this graph is looking suspiciously leaning towards, maybe this is more evidence for that working memory. And maybe if we try this with different texts or different setup, maybe it is more of a working memory phenomenon where we just force people to have these two things in mind. Okay, I know that's a lot of studies. So I'll start to wrap it up. So what do we know and where do we go from here? What we know is that ref texts seem to be effective. They seem to work in a boat and in a car and in a train and with a goat and on a boat. They seem to work wherever they are, and it's really hard to detract from them, and it's really hard to enhance them, right? Multimedia learning theory might suggest that graphics might either help or hinder. We didn't find much evidence of either of those things. The impact of graphics and emotions are still somewhat unknown, and this is especially interesting in terms of climate change. For some things, what we found is that refutation text about scary topics like GMOs or vaccines, an increase in knowledge is also accompanied by a decrease in negative emotions, but we don't find that with climate change. In fact, learning more about climate change tends to make everybody feel more upset. There's probably a good reason for that because climate change is really scary, and knowing more about it just makes it more scary. Whereas learning more about vaccines is pretty amazing. And so we're going to continue to push these theoretical boundary conditions. How do graphics facilitate? How might working memory facilitate? How might these models test against one another? um, to kind of tease out in the way that multimedia learning theory did on text and graphics, how do we move that paradigm shift and moving away from the question of do refutations work and more along the lines of how do they work for whom and under what conditions? So trying to get away from those, expository control conditions to again see if they work. So where do we go from here? Refutational teaching. In fact, during our meta-analysis, we had so many articles that we had to throw out because they were too interactional. They were taking place in a classroom setting. We had so many that we actually had another meta-analysis. And so that should be submitted for publication very soon. Also, with Victoria and Adam, looking at eco-anxiety around climate change. So specifically around climate change, how might we write text to and interventions to highlight both knowledge change and also emotion change, especially in really emotionally salient topics, especially for certain age groups that tend to be highly susceptible to those emotions. And how might we leverage different graphical approaches? So, graphical memes is one that we're exploring because that's a way of reading graphics in a way that other traditional graphics they've failed to work as refutations, but memes might actually function as a more complicated graphic processing, so that you could actually process them like a text, and maybe they'll function as a refutation. Okay. Whew, I know that was a lot. So I'll wrap it up. Thank you so much for listening to me go on, and I'll stop there for questions or comments or concerns.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Robert. It was really informative of the work that you've been doing for the last couple of years. I appreciate you going through all that. I'll open it up for the floor to, are there questions for Robert on the work that he's doing? I'll kick us off with one, Robert, and this is, our areas, they butt up against each other. And, in the original model, that need for cognition. So I had to have two questions off the top of my head. That need for cognition, how is that currently playing out in any of your work that you're doing? Do you feel like it's a viable piece? I see it in Gail Sinatra's model, not in any of the new working memory models, but I'm wondering if that's that hook, that individual personality trait of like the need to engage in complex problems. Has that been in any of your work, or are you seeing it in the meta-analysis?
So that's a really great question, and that hasn't shown up in much of the work that we've done, although it has in terms of some of the emotions. So some
Yeah,
of those epistemic emotions, like curiosity, tends to be an emotion that is it's not really positive nor negative because it can go kind of either way.
yeah,
Um, and so if you're curious enough and you kind of lean in and dig in, same with, we've kind of looked at some frustration too, where if you're frustrated enough to kind of want to keep reading and keep engaging, then that should predict engagement and then conceptual change. But if it's too overwhelming and you're just totally overwhelmed, then that might lead to you just checking out.
right.
And then you just fail to engage, and so then you don't learn or engage in conceptual change. But it's interesting that you mentioned that because a lot of her work and a lot of others would say these things are really important. And in previous meta-analyses too, they would say, things like emotions, we should be doing them. And then a lot of authors just don't include them or fail to report it if they did collect that data.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. Just the work that I do with early childhood. Curiosity is one of the things that we place interventions at curiosity. It's attached to mindfulness, executive functioning. And so curiosity is, we almost try to teach that approach of not getting too frustrated or not having judgments of positive or negative, right?
Hmm.
It's just, are you curious? Are you aware of it? Are you seeing it? And so it's really interesting that I saw it there and it's making connections.
Yeah, and some of the work that we've done, and Lombardi has picked this up and with his plausibility judgments, sort of like reasoning from evidence. So here's two models of what's happening, right? The skeptic model of climate change, where the sun is just having a larger output, and therefore that's why everything's getting warmer. And then current scientific conception. And here's three, four, five, six pieces of evidence, depending on developmental levels. How do these evidence, like, how do they support one model? Do they support both models?
Right.
Do they support none of the models? No judgments, just what do you think and kind of how do you reason through that? And then how might that lead you to um, a deeper understanding of like, oh yeah, there is a lot of evidence for this and not very much evidence for that.
Right. Kathleen, did you have a question? No? Okay, sorry. I thought I saw a hand go up. It was probably one of the floating applauses. It tricks my eyes sometimes. Is there anyone else who has any other questions? I'll go with one more, Robert. Have you done any measurement prior to like how, I don't know how to phrase this question, like how deeply do they believe the misconception? Like, how is it attached to their identity, right? I think some of these are politically charged, right? And
Hmm.
it could be wrapped up in their identity. And like, to me, a simple refutational text wouldn't then be effective. So I don't know, is there any pre-measurements of the depth of the belief? And I don't know if that would be the correct phrasing.
Yeah, so for a lot of them, if you're looking at like open-ended questions where you're asking students to really write down how do you understand this concept and really flesh it out, then we can kind of get to like, how deep is that understanding, whether or not it's flawed, and how much is actually there, rather than sort of true, false,
Right,
or multiple choice questions. Um, we've done some work. Well, okay, I'll say we've done some work, especially around climate change, where we look at sort of demographic variables of, let's say, politics, right?
right,
And how deeply you identify with either party. And what's really interesting is that for a lot of that work, um, if I know that piece of information, if I know what party you affiliate with, I can pretty accurately predict what you're going to say in terms of is it true or is it not true.
right.
But it does not correlate to how much knowledge you actually have about the topic. So if I just ask you, is this true or not? You say, yes, it's true, or no, it's not true. But if I ask you, okay, now explain to me how this actually works. What is the enhanced greenhouse effect and how is that changing temperatures? People on both sides have a hard time, a lot of misconceptions, and they don't really understand it. And so part of that is sort of a surface, um, you know, identification, um, not always with politics, but things like climate change. Yes, vaccines is a little trickier. Same with water
Yeah.
fluoridation. So that's why we started picking things that some people have strong opinions about, but again, might be really that depth of knowledge might not be there.
That's really interesting that the depth of knowledge isn't there on essentially both sides, right? To kind of nullify that correlation. We would assume that we would be more accurate, right? That's a really interesting finding.
Yeah, and it cuts both ways. There's folks that they're on both sides where, the party line is, well, this is true or this is not true, and that either conforms
And we
or
just go and believe it.
and regardless, both groups are equally misinformed of the science. Yeah. Which
More
is a
work for a
little,
science educator, all
yeah,
educators, right? We have a work ahead of us.
it's a little concerning, but yeah, Gail and I would always kind of, well, there's steady work ahead at least. At least we know that there's lots of work to be done and we won't be out of work anytime soon.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. I'll open up the floor again for anyone else who has questions.
I'll just ask one question here quick. So I've never done a meta-analysis before, and I'm kind of curious if you could just give, I don't know, a little bit of maybe some insight, wisdom tips, to anyone who hasn't done it, or like what you think about how to maybe start thinking about how you might approach doing something like that.
Yeah, so I mean, and I could defer to Femi too, who is teaching the class on meta-analysis. But for us, and to be fair, right, this was my first meta-analysis too, actually. Um, and so, Shola and Erica were really the driving forces around um, the actual meta-analyses, and we kind of pushed the bounds on some of those calculations. But as a researcher, what Gail and I and many others were getting really frustrated with was, we kept having to include in all of our studies, well, you have to have a control group to show that the refutation text is effective. And a lot of journals would not accept, oh, refutation only. It had to be a control group. And from an experimental point of view, that's a lot of participants that we're leveraging. And so we had to keep asking the same question. Are they effective? Yes. And now we can move on to the really interesting stuff that we as researchers were interested in. And so that was part of that frustration and curiosity is, can we just let this question, can we leave it be for a while? Can we have a piece of empirical evidence that says if a reviewer pushes back and we need a control condition, can we just say, no, we have these meta-analyses and they say it's effective? Because part of the interest for me is I'm not necessarily interested in the question of is it effective anymore. I want to see why is it effective and how is it effective and under what conditions. And so that's what was really motivating our search. And I don't know if that answers your question entirely, um, or if I sort of went off on a tangent. Sorry.
Totally fine. Totally fine. Yeah, it's just interesting to yeah, because it's a very different approach to looking at research and samples and inclusion and exclusion criteria. So just it's interesting to hear about it. So thank you for your presentation. Appreciate that.
Yeah, and we had, part of that too is we had a lot of really great minds in the room coming up with all those inclusions. We had Paniota who, she was on our advisory board. And so we have, sort of conceptual change from Gail and myself as PIs. And then we have an advisory board of folks from other theoretical backgrounds that are like, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? And that was the interesting thing for us with refutation text was that there is this conceptual change theory, but other people were leveraging ref texts from completely different theoretical backgrounds, but they were finding the same things. They were also finding that it worked. And so, how do we bring all of these people into conversation with each other to get everyone talking to really move the field forward? Um, we also got a lot of pushback from reviewers because coming from different theoretical lenses, maybe they don't like the CRKM. Maybe they like a knowledge in pieces approach. Um, so yeah, yeah, it was a really fun experience and really eye-opening and allowed us to really expand the work that we've been doing.
Well, thank you. Oh, go ahead, Laura. Are you good? Are you closing us out, Laura?
Yes, that was wonderful, Robert. Fascinating, useful to faculty, grad students, and others. I learned so much, and I'd like to let people know that we have another research conversation in November with Anne-Marie Garitas about Spencer, her successful Spencer grants. I know a lot of you applied for Spencer Foundation. And we're having an AI in education panel with 5 different faculty on October 20th. You'll be receiving ads on those, and we really appreciate all of you coming out. This was fabulous. We've recorded this so we can send those to your friends who couldn't attend. Thank you all, and we hope to see you at another event.
Thank you. And Laura and Shola, if and Sarah's idea of talking about meta-analysis and tips and tricks, that could be a whole session probably.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, yeah. So, all right. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everyone.